The Diplomat's Widow, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. Storm over Ravensmoor. The rain had begun somewhere over the Bristol Channel, or so Colonel Rupert Bagshaw insisted, as he squinted through the fogged window of the motor car, and by the time we crossed onto the Cornish peninsula, it had settled into the sort of steady, business-like downpour that suggested it meant to stay for days. I confess I had looked forward to this weekend with more enthusiasm than the weather now seemed to warrant. A fortnight's fishing, Bagshaw had promised, and good company, and the sea air that was meant to do wonders for a man newly returned from the tropics. Poirot, seated beside me with his hands folded neatly upon the silver head of his walking stick, appeared far less troubled by the prospect of rain than I was. "You are frowning, Hastings," he observed, without so much as glancing at me. "It is the weather, n'est-ce pas? You English are forever at war with your own climate, and forever losing." "It's meant to be summer," I said, somewhat defensively. "Ah, but the sea does not read the calendar." He smiled, that small private smile that meant he found something obscurely amusing, and returned his gaze to the window, where the hedgerows had given way to open moorland, grey and dripping, running down toward a line of cliffs I could not yet see but could certainly smell, that clean, cold mineral tang of the Atlantic. Ravensmoor House revealed itself gradually, the way old houses do, first as a smudge of grey stone against the greyer sky, then as a silhouette of gables and chimneys, and finally, as the motor car rounded the last bend, as a substantial Jacobean pile, standing foursquare against the weather on its own promontory, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that Bagshaw informed us, with evident relish, flooded twice daily with the tide. "Cuts us off completely for 4 hours out of every 12, he said. "Grandfather Averill built the place that way on purpose, so the story goes. Wanted somewhere no bailiff nor bill collector could reach him without an almanac and a great deal of patience." "How romantic," I said. "How inconvenient," said Poirot. "Should one require, for instance, a doctor?" I did not think much of the remark at the time. It was, after all, precisely the sort of dry observation Poirot was fond of making, and I attributed it to nothing more than his general suspicion of anything resembling romance. It was only very much later that I understood he had already begun, in some small chamber of that extraordinary mind, to take the measure of the house. We were received in the great hall by Lady Constance Averill herself, a tall, spare woman of perhaps 60, dressed in unrelieved black that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the 10 years since her husband's death, still worn like a uniform of office. Sir Edmund Averill had been, in his day, one of the Foreign Office's most celebrated men, an ambassador to 2 capitals, and a name spoken with hushed respect in the corridors of Whitehall. His widow had inherited not only his fortune, but a formidable portion of his manner, that particular chill courtesy which diplomats cultivate and which never entirely leaves them. "Colonel Bagshaw," she said, extending a hand ringed with sapphires, "you are gratifyingly punctual, though I cannot say the same for the weather. And these are your friends?" Bagshaw performed the introductions. I saw her dark eyes rest on Poirot for a fraction longer than courtesy required. Appraising, I thought, in the manner of a woman long accustomed to sizing up strangers at her table. "The Belgian detective," she said. "I have heard of you, Monsieur Poirot. My husband always said that the cleverest men in his profession and yours were remarkably alike. Both of you spend your lives learning to distrust what people tell you." "Madame," said Poirot, bowing over her hand, "your husband was, I think, a most perceptive man." "He was," she said, and something moved briefly behind the composed mask of her face. Grief, perhaps, or something colder. "Come in out of the wet. Mrs. Prentice will show you your rooms. We dine at 8, and I should warn you now that we are rather a full house this weekend, and not an entirely comfortable one." It was, I would come to think, as near to a warning as Lady Constance Averill ever gave anyone. The full house declared itself gradually over tea in the long drawing-room, whose windows looked out upon a garden already dissolving into mist. There was Julian Averill, Sir Edmund's son by an earlier marriage, a handsome, restless man of about 34, who managed what remained of the family's shipping interests, and who shook my hand with a grip a shade too firm, as though testing something. There was Gerald Fenwick, a nephew on the distaff side, younger, looser in his movements, with the slightly hunted eyes of a man doing rapid sums in his head. There was Miss Eleanor Hartley, watchful, who poured the tea with hands that did not quite steady themselves. There was Dr. Simon Reeve, the family physician, comfortable and greying, an old friend of the house. And there was, somewhat to my surprise, a young woman introduced simply as Miss Sophie Duval, dark-haired and pale, who had arrived, Bagshaw murmured to me later, quite unexpectedly 2 days before, and whom nobody seemed entirely able to explain. "A relation?" I asked him quietly. "That," said Bagshaw, "is precisely what nobody will say." I glanced at Poirot. He was sitting very upright in his chair, a cup of tea he had not touched cooling at his elbow, his small eyes moving from face to face with the particular stillness I had learned, over many years of friendship, to recognize as the beginning of interest. "You find something curious, Poirot?" I asked him later, as we dressed for dinner. "I find, mon ami," he said, brushing an invisible speck from his lapel with great precision, "that I have entered a house where everyone is extremely polite and no one is at all comfortable. It is a most interesting combination." Before we continue, a quick message for every mystery lover. If you're enjoying this story, you'll love the Baker Street Library, my collection of exclusive detective mystery ebooks available only in ebook format. Download instantly and enjoy your next investigation anytime. You'll find the link in the description, the pinned comment, and the channel description. Now, let's get back to the mystery. In my experience, it rarely lasts more than a day or two before something breaks. Mrs. Prentice showed us to our rooms herself, a stout, competent woman, with the particular gravity of a servant who has outlasted 2 generations of a family's fortunes and regards herself, not without justice, as one of the last reliable authorities upon its true history. She lingered a moment at my door, ostensibly to point out the vagaries of the water pipes, and confided, in the lowered voice servants reserve for observations they do not wish overheard by their employers, that the house had not seen so full a gathering since Sir Edmund's own funeral, and that her ladyship had been, not herself, in the weeks preceding our arrival, closeted for hours with Mr. Crane's correspondence, and short-tempered in a manner quite unlike her usual controlled reserve. "Not that I'd say a word against her, sir," she added hastily. "Only you did ask how the house seemed, and I'd not be doing my duty if I painted it rosier than it is." I thanked her, and thought little more of it until I repeated the exchange to Poirot over the business of dressing for dinner, at which point he set down his hairbrush with the sudden stillness of a man to whom an apparently idle remark has offered considerably more nourishment than its speaker intended. "Not herself, Hastings," he repeated softly, "and closeted with correspondence for hours together. That is a very great deal of trouble for a woman said, by everyone who has so far spoken of her, to conduct her affairs with the calm of long habit. I think, mon ami, we have arrived at Ravensmoor a little later than we ought. That, whatever storm has been gathering in this house, began to break not with our arrival, nor even with this weekend's company, but some weeks before either. In rooms and correspondence, we shall now have to reconstruct entirely from the memories of people who did not think, at the time, that any of it would matter. He was, as he so often was, entirely correct, though even he, I think, could not have said how soon, nor how terribly. Chapter 2. The Lady of the House. Dinner at Ravensmoor was announced by a great bronze gong in the hall, struck by Mrs. Prentice with a solemnity that suggested the ritual had not altered in 30 years, and we assembled in the dining-room beneath a row of ancestral Averills whose painted eyes seemed, in the candlelight, to follow the proceedings with a certain grim interest of their own. Lady Constance presided at the head of the table with the ease of long practice, directing conversation the way a conductor directs an orchestra, drawing out Colonel Bagshaw's reminiscences of Cairo, deflecting a question to Dr. Reeve about the state of his practice, and returning again and again, I noticed, to a subject that plainly interested her more than any other, the future of the family shipping concern, Averill and Sons, of which Julian was nominally the manager. "The Cardiff contracts are behind schedule," she said, quite without preamble, somewhere between the soup and the fish. "I had Mr. Crane look over the accounts last week. I saw Julian's hand still for the barest instant upon his wine-glass. Crane has no business going through the ledgers without my knowledge, mother." He had taken, I gathered, to calling her mother, though she was in fact his stepmother, a courtesy she seemed to accept without comment. "The Cardiff business is complicated. I've explained it to you a dozen times." "You have explained it to me," said Lady Constance, with a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "A dozen times in a dozen different ways, which is not quite the same thing as explaining it once, correctly. We shall discuss it after the weekend, when Mr. Crane can join us. I find these matters go better with a solicitor present to keep everyone honest." The silence that followed this remark lasted perhaps 3 seconds too long. "I say," put in Gerald Fenwick, with the too bright cheerfulness of a man eager to change the subject, "this Burgundy is really rather good, Aunt Constance. Where on earth do you still find it?" "I have my sources, Gerald," she said, "much as you appear to have yours, though I confess I have never quite discovered what they are, given the state of your allowance." Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, moved to him and lingered. "Mr. Aldous Crane tells me you called upon him last month regarding an advance against your expectations. I should be very interested to know what expectations you imagine you have." Gerald flushed a dull, unhappy red and said nothing. Beside me, I felt rather than saw Poirot's attention sharpen, like a hound that has caught a scent. It was left to Miss Duval, the mysterious guest, to break the silence this time, and she did it with a directness that startled the table. "Perhaps, Lady Constance," she said, in an accent that carried the faintest trace of the continent beneath careful English, "you would prefer to interrogate your family in private. It seems unkind to do it over the fish." There was a small collective intake of breath. Lady Constance turned her gaze upon the younger woman with an expression I found impossible to read. Not quite anger, not quite respect, but something that partook of both. "You are very bold, Miss Duval, for a guest of 2 days' standing." "I did not ask to be a guest," said Sophie Duval quietly. "I asked only for an hour of your time. You have given me 2 days of silence instead." "And you shall have your hour," said Lady Constance. "Tomorrow, if the weather permits, or the day after if it does not. The Causeway does not consult my convenience, Miss Duval, any more than it consults yours." She turned, with the finality of a door closing, to Colonel Bagshaw. "Rupert, tell me, is it true they mean to pension off old General Etheridge at last?" The conversation resumed its former channels, but I noticed that Julian Averill did not speak again for the remainder of the meal, and that Eleanor Hartley's eyes moved, again and again, to a small leather notebook she had brought to the table and set beside her plate, as though it were a talisman she dared not put down. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room after the cloth was drawn, I found myself, some 20 minutes later, summoned there in turn to take coffee, and observed a tableau that struck me, even then, as curiously strained for so ordinary a domestic scene. Lady Constance sat near the fire with her embroidery frame before her, though I noticed she set not a single stitch the whole half-hour I watched, her needle poised and motionless above the canvas, while her eyes rested, with an unreadable expression, upon Eleanor Hartley across the room. Sophie Duval had taken up a book from the shelves, but did not, I think, read a single page of it, and Eleanor herself sat very upright at the piano, playing nothing, her fingers resting upon the closed lid, as though she had begun to play and abandoned the attempt before the first note sounded. "You do not care for music this evening, Mademoiselle Hartley?" I ventured, more from a desire to break the uncomfortable silence than any real curiosity. "I find I cannot concentrate upon it tonight, Captain Hastings," she said, with a small apologetic smile that did not reach her eyes. "There has been rather a great deal on my mind of late." Lady Constance's needle, I noticed, remained perfectly still above her canvas throughout this brief exchange, though her gaze had not shifted from her secretary for even a moment, and I confess I came away from that half hour with the distinct and uneasy impression of a household holding its collective breath, waiting for some pronouncement that had not yet, on that particular evening, been made. It was left to Poirot, when the gentlemen rejoined the ladies for a final hand of bridge before the household retired, to draw Lady Constance briefly aside near the fireplace, ostensibly to admire a small Meissen figure upon the mantel, and I saw the two of them exchange some low words I could not catch, at the end of which our hostess laughed, a short, dry sound with very little true amusement in it, and said, loudly enough for me to hear across the room, "You are a very perceptive man, Monsieur Poirot, and I begin to think it was fortunate rather than accidental that Rupert brought you here this weekend. Perhaps, before you leave us, I shall ask your advice on a small family matter. Perhaps, later, over brandy in the smoking room, from which the ladies had withdrawn, in the old-fashioned Lady Constance evidently preferred." Dr. Reeve leaned toward Poirot with the easy confidentiality of a man among strangers he does not expect to see again. "You mustn't think too much of the family sparring, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "Lady Constance rules this house the way her husband ruled an embassy. Total control, total information, and God help anyone who tries to keep a secret from her. It's not unkindness, it's simply how she is made." "And her heart, Doctor," said Poirot, with a mildness that I, knowing him, recognized as entirely deliberate. "It is, I think, not so strong as the rest of her?" Dr. Reeve looked faintly surprised. "You've a sharp eye, Monsieur Poirot." "Yes, angina, and not a mild case. I've had her on digitalis drops for 3 years now. She won't hear of slowing down, of course. Told me once that a diplomat's widow who rests is a diplomat's widow who is forgotten, and she did not intend to be forgotten." He shook his head, with the fondness of long acquaintance. "Stubborn as the devil, but there it is. I keep the bottle in her dressing room myself, measure the dose each night. Can't trust her to do it accurately. She'd take too little, out of sheer impatience, or forget entirely and take too much to catch up." "How very precise a business," murmured Poirot. "The human heart." I thought nothing of the exchange at the time, beyond a vague sympathy for our formidable hostess. It was only in the days that followed that I came to understand Poirot had, in that quiet after-dinner conversation, already been given the one fact upon which the entire tragedy would turn. Chapter 3. A Silence After Midnight. I was woken, some time after 2 in the morning, by the sound of the sea. It was, I told myself groggily, only the tide against the rocks below the house, magnified by the strange acoustics of an old building in a storm, and yet I lay awake some minutes, listening, before sleep reclaimed me. I mention it now only because Poirot, when I described the night to him afterward, considered the hour with great interest and made me repeat the details twice. It was Mrs. Prentice who discovered her. She told it to us later, in the halting, horrified manner of a woman whose 30 years of unshakable composure had, in a single moment, entirely deserted her. How she had gone, as was her habit, at 7:30, to knock upon my lady's study door with the morning tray, for Lady Constance kept early hours, and liked her tea and correspondence together before the household stirred. How there had been no answer, though this was not in itself unusual, for her ladyship sometimes fell asleep in her chair over her papers. How she had gone in regardless, and found her. Lady Constance Averill sat in the wing chair beside her writing desk. her head fallen slightly to one side, as though she had merely drifted into an uncomfortable doze. The lamp on the desk still burned, pale and useless against the grey morning light, now filtering through the curtains she had not troubled to draw closed. A small sherry glass, empty, stood upon the desk at her elbow. Her spectacles had slipped down her nose. Her hands lay folded in her lap with a neatness that seemed, in retrospect, almost too composed, the posture of a woman arranged, rather than a woman who had simply died. She had been dead, Dr. Reeve pronounced within the half-hour, for some 6 or 7 hours at the least. The house that morning had the particular quality of stunned silence that follows any sudden death. Doors opening and closing softly, voices dropping to murmurs, the ordinary business of breakfast abandoned half-eaten on the sideboard. I found Poirot already dressed and standing at the window of our shared corridor, looking down at the causeway, where the tide, I could see even from that distance, lay high and full across the narrow strip of stone that was the house's only connection to the world beyond. "The doctor says her heart," I said. "Poor woman. I suppose it isn't so very surprising, given what Reeve told us last night." "No," said Poirot slowly. "It is not surprising. That, mon ami, is rather what troubles me." "Troubles you? Surely a weak heart giving out in the night is the least troubling explanation imaginable." "It is the most convenient explanation imaginable," said Poirot, "which is not always the same thing. Tell me, Hastings, when a woman such as Lady Constance Averill, a woman of iron will, a woman who has spent 40 years learning to control every room she enters, feels the pain of her heart beginning to seize, does she sit quietly in her chair with her hands folded, like a child at prayer? Or does she reach, perhaps, for the bell pull at her elbow? Does she call out? Does she, at the very least, knock the sherry glass from the desk in the convulsion of the moment?" I had no answer for this, and said so. "Nor," said Poirot, "do I, yet. But I have observed the room, Hastings, while the good doctor made his examination, and I will tell you 3 small things that interest me very much." The clock upon the mantel had stopped at 11 minutes past 11. The grate, though the night was not especially cold, contained the ashes of paper that had been quite deliberately burned, and the little bottle of medicine that Dr. Reeve keeps for her in the dressing-room next door, the bottle from which, he tells me, he measures each night's dose with his own hand. That bottle, when I looked at it not 1 hour ago, was very nearly empty, though he swears to me it was 3/4 full only 2 evenings past. I stared at him. "Poirot, you cannot mean—" "I mean nothing yet," said Poirot, holding up a hand. "Beyond what I have told you. It is far too early for meaning, Hastings. It is not too early, however, for questions, and it is a very great pity for someone in this house that the tide will not permit the police to arrive before this afternoon at the earliest, for it means that I, who am only a guest under this roof, and have no authority whatsoever to do so, must occupy myself in the meantime by asking a great many of them." Chapter 4. The Doctor's Verdict. Dr. Reeve's certificate, drawn up within the hour, and shown to the assembled household with the solemn finality of a man closing a book, declared the cause of death to be heart failure, consistent with the angina from which Lady Constance had suffered for upward of 3 years. It was, everyone agreed, a tragedy, but scarcely a mystery. A woman of 60 with a weak heart, found dead in her chair of a morning, was sad news, not shocking news, and the household seemed, on the surface, to accept it with the particular relief of people grateful to be spared a worse alternative. Only Poirot did not sign that particular book closed. He found Dr. Reeve alone in the morning room shortly before noon, methodically packing away his instruments with the brisk efficiency of a man anxious to have an unpleasant duty behind him, and I trailed after my friend as I generally did, sensing that something of interest was about to occur. "Doctor," said Poirot, without preamble, "the medicine bottle in Lady Constance's dressing-room. You measured her dose yourself each evening, you told us. How much, precisely, did the bottle contain when last you measured it? Dr. Reeve looked up, faintly startled. I couldn't say to the drop, Monsieur Poirot. Enough for perhaps another 10 days' dosing, at a guess, when I measured it Thursday evening. And the dose itself? 15 drops, in a little water, each night before bed. It's not a casual medicine, digitalis. Too little does no good. Too much stops the heart, rather than steadying it. That's precisely why I measure it myself, rather than trust the bottle to the household. He frowned. Why do you ask? Because, said Poirot, when I examined that bottle this morning, Doctor, it held scarcely enough for a single further dose. 3/4 full on Thursday, you say, and now very nearly empty, in the space of 2 days and 1 death. That is a great quantity of medicine to have vanished so quickly, is it not? Even allowing for her final, fatal dose. Dr. Reeve's ruddy face had gone rather pale. That's quite impossible. I measured her dose myself Friday evening, before we all went in to dinner. 15 drops, no more, no less, as always. And last night, there was a silence. Last night, said Dr. Reeve slowly, I did not measure it myself. Lady Constance told me, when I came to her room before dinner, that she felt perfectly well and would take her own drops before retiring, as she was in the habit of doing on those rare occasions I was called away. I thought nothing of it. She had done it a dozen times before without incident. Ah, said Poirot softly. Then it is possible, is it not, Docteur, that on this one occasion someone other than Lady Constance measured that final, fatal dose, and measured it with considerably less care for her well-being than you yourself would have shown. Dr. Reeve sat down rather heavily in the nearest chair. Good God, Poirot, you're suggesting she was murdered. I am suggesting, said Poirot precisely, that a bottle of medicine has emptied itself a great deal faster than arithmetic allows, that a woman of considerable self-command died in a posture of unnatural repose, that a fire was lit in June to burn papers someone did not wish read, and that a clock upon the mantelpiece stopped at 11 minutes past 11 for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with its mechanism, since I have this morning wound it myself and found it keeps perfect time. I am suggesting, Docteur, that we should be very foolish indeed to close our eyes simply because it is more comfortable to do so. Will you amend your certificate? Aye. Dr. Reeve passed a hand over his face. The causeway won't clear till 3 this afternoon. If I amend it now, before the police arrive, then you will have given yourself and me several hours in which to gather what the tide will otherwise wash away, said Poirot. Grief and shock do strange things to a household's tongue, Docteur. People confess, in the first hours after a death, things they will have carefully reconsidered by the time a policeman arrives with his notebook and his official manner. I should like to make use of those hours, with your permission and Lady Constance's family's consent, before that opportunity is lost to us like the causeway beneath the tide. Dr. Reeve looked at him for a long moment, and something in Poirot's quiet, absolute certainty seemed to settle the matter for him more thoroughly than any argument could have done. Very well, he said heavily. God help us all. Very well, Monsieur Poirot. Ask your questions. Chapter 5. Little Grey Cells Awaken. It fell to Colonel Bagshaw, as our host's oldest friend and the nearest thing the shaken household possessed to a figure of authority in the absence of both husband and police, to gather the family in the library and explain, with visible difficulty, that Dr. Reeve now had reason to believe Lady Constance's death might not, after all, have been entirely natural, and that Monsieur Poirot, whose reputation, Bagshaw reminded them, was not inconsiderable, had offered to look into the matter until such time as the proper authorities could cross the causeway. The reaction, I thought, watching from my chair by the window, was instructive in itself. Julian Averill went very still, the way a man goes still when he has received a blow he half expected. Gerald Fenwick made a small, strangled sound that might have been protest or might have been fear, and reached for the whisky decanter with a hand that shook visibly. Eleanor Hartley pressed her small leather notebook, the same one she had guarded so carefully at dinner, flat against her chest, as though it might shield her from something. Sophie Duval alone showed no surprise at all, only a kind of grim, waiting stillness, as though she had expected precisely this from the moment she arrived. "Murder," said Julian, at last, in a voice that fought hard for steadiness and did not entirely achieve it. "You cannot be serious. My stepmother had a heart condition that half the county could have told you would kill her within the year." "That is very possibly true, Monsieur Averill," said Poirot mildly. "It is also possible that someone in this house was not content to wait the year." "This is monstrous," said Julian. "You come into this house as a guest, and within a day you are accusing." "I have accused no one," Poirot said, with a courtesy that somehow carried more menace than any raised voice could have done. "I have observed a bottle of medicine, a stopped clock, and a fire lit in a warm month to burn papers someone preferred destroyed. I ask only for the moment to understand the ordinary shape of this house and its inhabitants, so that I may recognize what is extraordinary when I find it." "Is that so very monstrous a request, Monsieur Averill, from a woman who was, after all, your own stepmother?" Julian said nothing further, but I saw the muscle working in his jaw. It was Poirot's habit, in the investigations I had witnessed over the years, to begin not with accusation, but with the quiet accumulation of the ordinary, the daily rhythms of a household, out of which any deviation stands eventually revealed, as a single false note declares itself against an otherwise faultless melody. He spent that first hour walking the house alone, and I did not follow him, knowing from long experience that he preferred, at this stage of an inquiry, the company of his own thoughts. I found him, eventually, in Lady Constance's study, standing quite motionless before the cold grate, his hands clasped behind his back, regarding the small heap of ashes with the same rapt attention another man might have given a masterpiece of painting. "Anything?" I asked. "Everything, Hastings, and as yet nothing that I can prove." He crouched with some difficulty, and produced from his pocket a pair of tweezers I had seen him use 100 times before, and with these he extracted, with infinite delicacy, a small fragment of paper that had survived the flames at its charred edge. He held it up to the window light. I could make out, upon the scrap, a few words in a strong, slanting hand. Figures, it looked like, and a fragment of what might have been the word shortfall. "A ledger," I said slowly. "Or part of one." "Or part of one," Poirot agreed. "Burned Hastings on the very night its owner died, which suggests to me either that Lady Constance herself destroyed it, for reasons of her own, or that someone else destroyed it after her death, in the brief hours before Mrs. Prentice discovered her body, for reasons very much their own indeed. And observe," he gestured toward the mantel clock, its hands frozen at 11 minutes past 11, "that whoever stopped this clock did so, I think, not by accident but by design, and did so, moreover, at a time considerably earlier than the hour at which our unfortunate hostess actually died, if the state of the body when Dr. Reeve examined it is any true guide. You think someone moved the clock to suggest an earlier time of death?" "I think," said Poirot, rising and dusting his knees with fastidious care, "that someone in this house wished very much for us to believe Lady Constance died at 11 minutes past 11, when in fact, and here, Hastings, is where the little grey cells must earn their dinner, I believe she died a good deal later than that, at an hour when a particular person's whereabouts might otherwise have proved considerably more difficult to explain." Chapter 6. The interviews begin. Poirot conducted his interviews that afternoon in the small morning room overlooking the garden, a chamber he had selected, he told me, precisely because its single window commanded a view of the causeway, so that he might watch, even as he questioned each member of the household in turn, the slow retreat of the tide that would, in a few hours, bring the outside world, and with it, the law, flooding back into Ravensmoor's isolation. Julian Averill came first, and sat throughout the interview with the particular rigid composure of a man determined to give nothing away, which is, as Poirot remarked to me afterward, very often the surest way of giving everything away. "You manage the family's shipping interests, Monsieur Averill," said Poirot, without preamble. "Averill and Sons. It flourishes, I hope." "Well enough," said Julian. "Your stepmother did not entirely share that opinion, I think. She spoke, at dinner last evening, of accounts examined by a Mr. Crane, and of a shortfall in the Cardiff contracts." "My stepmother," said Julian, with careful evenness, "enjoyed keeping a close eye on matters that were not, strictly, her concern. It was a habit of hers. My father left the business to my management, not to her interference." "And yet," said Poirot, "I am given to understand that the greater part of the capital remains, even now, legally hers to dispose of as she wishes, under the terms of your father's will. Is that not so?" Julian's composure cracked very slightly at the corners. "You've been talking to Crane." "I have not yet had the pleasure," said Poirot mildly. "I am merely observant, Monsieur Averill. Where were you last night, between the hour of 11 and, let us say, 1:30? "In my room. Asleep. Alone, of course. Naturally alone. This isn't that sort of house party, Monsieur Poirot." A ghost of his earlier arrogance returned. "You'll find no one to vouch for me, if that's what you're asking, and no one to contradict me either. Make of that what you like." He was permitted to go, and Gerald Fenwick took his place, a young man rendered almost incoherent by nerves, who admitted, after a great deal of stammering circumlocution, that he had indeed approached the family solicitor for an advance against his eventual inheritance, and that Lady Constance had, upon learning of it, threatened in no uncertain terms to alter her will so as to exclude him from any expectation whatsoever. "She said I was no better than my father," Gerald said miserably, "who ran through 2 fortunes before he was 40. Perhaps she was right. I don't know. I only know I owe rather a frightening amount of money to rather frightening people, Monsieur Poirot, and I had hoped, God forgive me for saying it now, I had hoped she might soften before quarter day." "And did she soften?" "No," said Gerald, and put his face in his hands. "No, she did not soften at all." Eleanor Hartley, when her turn came, proved a harder subject, not through evasion, for she answered each question with the precise, careful thoroughness of a woman trained for 12 years to organize another person's affairs, but through a visible and increasing distress that seemed to grow with each question rather than diminish. "You were her secretary and companion," said Poirot gently. "You knew, I think, a very great deal of what passed through this house, its accounts, its correspondence, its small secrets." "It was my position to know such things," Eleanor said. "I do not think it made me privileged. It made me careful." "The notebook you carried so anxiously to dinner last evening, mademoiselle, may I ask what it contains?" Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened perceptibly. "Household accounts," she said, "nothing more." "I think," said Poirot, with great gentleness, and yet with an implacability I recognized very well, "that we shall return to that notebook, Mademoiselle Hartley, a little later in our conversation, when you have had time to consider whether that is entirely the truth." She left the room very pale, and did not look at any of us as she went. Chapter 7. The Ledger in the Ash. It was Eleanor Hartley who returned, unbidden, some 2 hours later, as the afternoon light was beginning to lengthen across the garden, and the tide, visible from our window, had dropped enough to bear the first grey stones of the causeway. "I should like to speak with you again, Monsieur Poirot," she said, standing in the doorway with the notebook clutched before her like a shield. "Alone, if Captain Hastings will forgive me." I made to withdraw, but Poirot lifted a hand. "Captain Hastings is entirely discreet, mademoiselle, and I find a witness useful on occasions such as this. Please, sit." She sat at the very edge of the chair, as though poised for flight. "You asked about the notebook. I lied to you, Monsieur Poirot. and I have been ashamed of it every moment since. It is not household accounts. It was a record I kept, over some months, of discrepancies I found in the shipping ledgers, Mr. Averil's ledgers. Discrepancies, said Poirot. Money, said Eleanor, that left the accounts and did not return in cargo, or contracts, or anything I could trace. Small sums at first, easily overlooked, then larger ones. I am not a fool, Monsieur Poirot, whatever else I may be, and I have kept this family's books alongside Lady Constance's correspondence for 12 years. I know what an honest ledger looks like, and I knew, some 4 months ago, that I was no longer looking at one. And you told Lady Constance? Not at once. Eleanor's voice had dropped almost to a whisper. I did not wish to be the one to destroy him in her eyes. Julian, I mean. Whatever his faults, he is her husband's son, and she loved him, in her fashion, however little affection passed between them on the surface. But 2 weeks ago the sums became too large to ignore, and I told her everything. I showed her the notebook. And her response? She was magnificent and terrible, Eleanor said, with something that might almost have been admiration beneath the fear. She did not rage, or weep, or any of the things a lesser woman might have done. She simply thanked me, very quietly, and told me she would deal with the matter in her own time and her own way. She said, Eleanor's composure wavered at last. She said that a diplomat's widow does not act in anger, Monsieur Poirot. She acts when she has all the facts, and not one moment before. And had she, by last evening, all the facts she required? I believe so. She told Mr. Crane to attend this coming Monday, with the complete accounts. I believe she meant to confront Julian formally then, in Mr. Crane's presence, and alter the terms of the family trust accordingly. Eleanor pressed the notebook harder against her chest. I have carried this thing for 2 weeks like a stone in my pocket, Monsieur Poirot, and now she is dead, and I cannot stop asking myself whether it was my notebook that killed her, whether, if I had never shown it to her, she would still be alive this morning. That, mademoiselle, said Poirot, not unkindly, is a question with only one honest answer, and it is not the one you fear. It was not your notebook that killed her. It was, if my suspicions prove correct, the very great desperation of a man who understood, perhaps only last night, that his stepmother now possessed every fact she required to ruin him utterly, and who could not afford to wait until Monday to discover what she intended to do with them. He held out his hand. May I see the notebook, mademoiselle? All of it, if you please, not merely the fragments the fire did not consume. She gave it to him without another word, and I watched Poirot's face, as he turned the pages, settle into the particular stillness of a man who has found precisely what he expected to find, and takes no pleasure whatsoever in the finding of it. Chapter 8. Gerald's Debts. The notebook, when Poirot laid its contents before me privately that evening, told a story of slow and increasingly desperate embezzlement, stretching back the better part of a year, sums diverted from the Cardiff shipping contracts through a series of falsified invoices, growing bolder and less carefully concealed as the months progressed, until the most recent entries showed a shortfall that ran, by Eleanor's careful reckoning, to several £1,000s. A man does not steal so much, nor so recklessly toward the end, Poirot observed, unless he is being driven by some pressure beyond mere greed. Greed is patient, Hastings. Desperation is not. It was this observation that sent him, that same evening, in search of Gerald Fenwick once more, not, as I first supposed, to renew his suspicion of the young man's own debts, but to ask a question that seemed, on its face, to have nothing whatever to do with the case. Your bookmaker, Monsieur Fenwick, said Poirot, finding Gerald alone in the billiard-room, disconsolately chalking a cue he showed no intention of using. The frightening people to whom you owe money, would their custom, by any chance, extend also to Monsieur Julian Averil? Gerald looked up, startled. Julian? Good Lord, no. Julian doesn't gamble. Thinks it beneath him, actually. Rather makes a point of saying so. He frowned. Why do you ask? Because a man who does not gamble and does not drink to excess and keeps no mistress that the household gossip has discovered presents me with a puzzle, Monsieur Fenwick, when I find several £1,000s have vanished through his ledgers with nothing whatsoever to show for it. Money does not simply evaporate, it goes somewhere. I should very much like to know where Monsieur Averil's has gone. Gerald hesitated, turning the chalk over in his fingers. I don't like to speak ill of family, he said slowly, particularly not now, with Aunt Constance barely, but there was talk, a year or so back, of an investment. Some scheme in South American shipping insurance that Julian went in for rather heavily, against against Sir Edmund's old advice never to speculate with the firm's capital. I only know of it because I overheard him rowing with Crane about it once, in the study, when I'd come to ask about my own wretched advance. Crane was furious, told him he was gambling with money that wasn't his to lose. And the scheme? Failed, I gather, rather spectacularly, sometime last winter. I don't know the details. Julian's never spoken of it since, and I never dared ask. Gerald set down the cue entirely. You think that's it? You think he took the money to cover his own losses, and kept taking more when the first lot wasn't enough? I think, Monsieur Fenwick, said Poirot carefully, that it is a hypothesis that fits the shape of what I have observed a great deal better than any I have yet considered. But a hypothesis, however elegant, is not a proof, and I do not accuse a man of murder on the strength of an overheard quarrel and an empty ledger alone. I require something more. I require, in fact, to know precisely where Monsieur Julien Averil was between the hours of 11 and 1:30 last night. A question to which he has so far given me only the answer that no one can either confirm or deny it. It was a problem, I reflected, that seemed at that hour entirely insoluble, given the emptiness of the sleeping house at such an hour and the absence of any witness to vouch for a single soul among its inhabitants. I did not yet understand, as Poirot, I think, already half suspected, that the sea itself, indifferent and exact in its comings and goings, had been keeping a far more faithful record of that night than any human witness could have done. Chapter 9. The Woman from the Village. It was Sophie Duval who occupied Poirot's attention that evening, once Gerald had gone, and I confess I approached her interview with more curiosity than any that had preceded it, for her presence at Ravensmoor remained, even after 2 days, entirely unexplained. "You will forgive me, mademoiselle," said Poirot, when she had seated herself with a composure I had not seen in any other member of the household, "if I ask you a question that is perhaps indelicate. Why are you here?" "I have been asking myself the same thing since Lady Constance died," said Sophie Duval, "and wondering whether I ought to have stayed away in the first place." She was silent a moment, studying her own hands. "My father's name was Marcus Trent, Monsieur Poirot. Does it mean anything to you?" Poirot's brow furrowed briefly, then cleared. "The name is familiar to me, though I cannot at once place it. A diplomatic scandal, I think. Some years before the war. 22 years ago," said Sophie. "My father served under Sir Edmund Averil in Constantinople. There was an affair, a matter of falsified dispatches, blamed entirely on my father, though I have spent my whole life believing, and believe still, that the fault lay elsewhere, higher up the chain of command than anyone ever cared to look. He was disgraced, recalled. He took his own life 18 months later, in a rented room in Marseille, and I was raised by my mother's family in France, who told me almost nothing of what had happened until I was old enough to go looking for the truth myself. And the truth led you here. The truth led me to a name, Sir Edmund Averil, and to the belief, which I still hold, that he knew far more of the falsified dispatches than he ever admitted, and that his silence, whether from ambition or cowardice, cost my father his career, his reputation, and finally his life. Sir Edmund is beyond my questioning now, Monsieur Poirot. He has been dead these 10 years, but his widow is not, was not, and I came here to ask her, simply, whether she knew the truth of what her husband had done, and whether she would help me clear my father's name at last, even now, even so many years too late to matter to anyone but me. And did she answer you? No. Sophie's composure faltered, just slightly. She put me off, again and again, with that maddening diplomatic courtesy of hers. An hour tomorrow, an hour the day after. And now she is dead, and I shall never have my answer. And I imagine, Monsieur Poirot, that you are wondering whether I killed her out of impatience, or spite, or 22 years of accumulated grievance. I wonder a great many things, mademoiselle, said Poirot. It is my profession to wonder. Where were you last night, between 11 and 1:30? In my room. I heard the sea, and I could not sleep, and I sat by my window a long while, looking out at the causeway in the moonlight, thinking about my father, and about the questions I would never now have answered. She met his eyes directly. I saw no one, Monsieur Poirot, and no one, I imagine, saw me. It is not, I am aware, an alibi that will satisfy a policeman. Poirot regarded her for a long moment, with an expression I found difficult to read. Tell me, mademoiselle, you say you sat by your window, looking toward the causeway. At what hour, approximately, did you take up this vigil, and at what hour did you finally retire? From perhaps 10:30 until nearly 2, she said, puzzled by the question. Why do you ask? Because a woman who sits at her window from 10:30 until nearly 2, looking out upon the one road that connects this house to the mainland, said Poirot slowly, is a woman who has, without perhaps intending it, made herself a witness to a great deal more than she yet realizes. Think carefully, Mademoiselle Duval. In all that time, did you see any light, any movement, any figure at all, upon the causeway or about the grounds below? Sophie frowned, casting her mind back. There was a light, she said slowly. Quite late, after midnight, I think, though I could not swear to the hour precisely. Down by the boathouse, at the foot of the cliff path. It moved, as though someone carried a lantern, and then it was gone. Poirot sat back in his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man to whom a scattered hand of cards has suddenly begun to arrange itself into a pattern. The boathouse, he said softly. Ah, now we begin, I think, to make progress. Chapter 10. Tides and Alibis. The boathouse stood at the foot of a steep cliff path some quarter-mile from the main house, a squat stone structure housing 2 small sailing dinghies, and, Poirot discovered upon inspection the following morning, a stout iron ring set into the rock beside the water, where the tide chart for the causeway was posted, weathered but legible, beneath a small glass frame. A courtesy, the boatman later explained, for guests unfamiliar with the treacherous local currents. Poirot studied this chart with the close attention of a scholar poring over a rare manuscript, and I confess I could make little of the columns of figures myself, until he explained, with the patient thoroughness he reserved for what he considered my more obtuse moments, that the tide had been at its lowest ebb that night at precisely 20 minutes past midnight, and would not have covered the causeway again, even at its earliest returning edge, before 1:30. Why does this matter? I asked. Because, mon ami, Monsieur Julian Averill, informed me yesterday that he retired to his room at 11 and remained there, alone, until morning. And yet, Poirot crouched with a small grunt of effort beside the muddy verge of the path where it turned down toward the boathouse door. Observe these footprints, Hastings, preserved with really quite remarkable clarity in the mud, which did not dry, given the rain, until well after midnight. A man's boot, and a distinctive one. See here, the mended heel, a repair done crudely, with the wrong size of nail, so that it leaves a mark no other boot in this house would make. You mean to compare it against the household's boots? I mean, said Poirot, rising, that I have already done so, this very morning, while you slept later than is your custom, Hastings, and I found the match in the boot-room, cleaned and polished, and returned to its place by a careful valet who had no notion of what secret he was, in his diligence, attempting to erase. "The boots belong to Monsieur Julien Averil." I stared at him. Then he lied. He wasn't in his room at all. He was, I think, in this boathouse, or very near it, at some hour after midnight. Precisely the hour, if Mademoiselle Duval's testimony from her window may be trusted, at which a lantern was seen moving upon this path. Poirot straightened, brushing the mud from his gloves with visible distaste. "But consider further, Hastings, what the tide itself tells us. If Monsieur Averil was here, at the boathouse, at some time after midnight, he could not, the causeway being fully covered until 1:30, have crossed to the mainland and returned in that interval, as a less careful investigator might have supposed him attempting. No, whatever brought him down this cliff path in the small hours of the night, it was not an escape from the house, nor a rendezvous beyond it. It was something that required no more than the boathouse itself." "What, though?" "That," said Poirot, "is precisely what I intend to discover before this day is out. Though I confess, mon ami, I already have a very shrewd notion, and I do not think you will care for it any better than I do myself." He turned, without further explanation, and pushed open the boathouse door, and together we stepped into the cool, tar and salt-smelling dimness within, where the two small dinghies rocked gently at their moorings, and where, in the shadowed corner behind a coil of rope, Poirot's questing eye almost immediately discovered a small tin, half buried beneath a folded tarpaulin, that had certainly not been left there by any fisherman. Chapter 11. The Missing Cufflink. The tin, when Poirot opened it with the same delicate care he might have applied to a jeweller's case, proved to contain nothing more sinister than a scattering of old fishing flies and a coil of gut line, and yet, tucked beneath this innocent debris, wedged into the corner of the tin, as though it had slipped there unnoticed, lay a single gold cufflink, engraved with a small ornate monogram. "So it would appear," said Poirot, turning the small object over thoughtfully in his gloved fingers. "And yet I find myself wondering, Hastings, why a man should carry a spare cufflink to a boathouse in the dead of night, tucked into a fishing tin of all improbable places, unless—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing. "Unless what?" "Unless it was not carried here at all, mon ami, but lost here, dropped perhaps in some moment of haste or agitation, and never missed until it was already too late to search for it discreetly." Poirot pocketed the cufflink with great care. "I recall now that when I examined Monsieur Averil's cuffs yesterday evening, at dinner, both were fastened with links of a plain, unremarkable design, not this pattern at all. A small thing, Hastings, and yet small things are, in my experience, very often the hinges upon which the largest doors swing." We returned to the house to find it once more astir, for the tide had at last withdrawn sufficiently to bear the causeway, and a police motor car could be seen, even from the drawing-room windows, making its slow and careful way across the wet stones toward Ravensmoor. Inspector Yardley of the County Constabulary proved, upon his arrival, to be a broad, unhurried man, with a countryman's patience and a healthy respect for Poirot's reputation, which he had evidently encountered before in the course of his professional reading, and he listened with growing gravity to the account Poirot and Dr. Reeve laid before him of the medicine bottle, the stopped clock, the burned ledger, and the footprints leading to the boathouse. "You'll want to search the young gentleman's room, then, before he's had further chance to tidy anything away," Yardley said, when the recitation was complete. "I think," said Poirot, "we shall find little there now, Inspector, beyond what a careful man leaves for the eye that is not looking closely enough. I should prefer, if you permit it, to confront Monsieur Averil directly with what we have already gathered, and observe how a guilty man, if guilty he is, conducts himself under the pressure of a truth he believes still concealed." It was at this moment, as though summoned by the very mention of his name, that Julien Averil himself appeared in the doorway of the drawing-room, his face pale and set, his eyes moving swiftly from Poirot to the inspector, and back again, with the particular wariness of a man who senses, without yet knowing precisely how, that the net has drawn considerably tighter about him since he last took its measure. "I understand," he said, with a coldness that did not entirely mask the tremor beneath it, "that you have been asking questions about my whereabouts last night, Monsieur Poirot, and about a matter of missing cufflinks. I should be glad to hear precisely what it is you imagine you have discovered." "Not imagine, Monsieur Averil," said Poirot gently, drawing the small gold object from his pocket and holding it up so that it caught the grey afternoon light. "Discovered, in the boathouse, beneath a fisherman's tin, where a man might drop it in the darkness and never notice its absence until it was very much too late to retrieve it unobserved." I watched the colour drain entirely from Julian Averil's face and understood, in that instant, that whatever remained to be untangled in this case, the essential shape of the truth had already, in Poirot's mind, been settled beyond any serious doubt. Chapter 12. Old Wounds Surface. It was Colonel Bagshaw, drawn aside by Poirot that same afternoon, while Inspector Yardley conducted a more formal search of the grounds, who at last supplied the missing chapter of Sir Edmund Averil's history that gave Sophie Duval's presence at Ravensmoor its full and melancholy context. "Trent's case," Bagshaw said heavily, settling into a chair in the library with the air of a man revisiting ground he had long hoped never to walk again. "Yes, I remember it well enough. I was in Constantinople myself that year, on attachment. Ugly business. Someone had been passing altered dispatches to the Turkish ministry, information that ought never to have left the embassy walls, and when it came to light, the blame fell on young Trent, who'd handled the relevant correspondence. And was the blame just, Colonel?" Bagshaw was silent a long moment. "I never thought so, if I'm honest with you, Poirot, though I never said as much at the time. A man doesn't in that world, not without proof, and not without ending his own career alongside the fellow he's trying to defend. There were others who might have had the access and the motive, and I always suspected Edmund knew a good deal more of the true circumstances than he ever admitted at the inquiry. But Trent was convenient, junior, without powerful friends, easily sacrificed to close the matter quickly and quietly, which was, above all things, what the Foreign Office wanted that year. Edmund gave the evidence that sealed it. I've always wondered whether he did it from genuine belief, or from the calculation that his own career would survive the scandal a great deal more comfortably if someone else were made to carry the weight of it. And Lady Constance, did she know this history? She knew it as well as I did, I should think, though she never spoke of it in my hearing, not once in 20 years. Loyalty to Edmund's memory, I always assumed, or perhaps simple diplomatic reticence, the habit of a lifetime, never to revisit a closed file. Bagshaw shook his head slowly. Poor Trent, poor girl. Come to that, arriving here after all these years hoping for some scrap of truth from a woman who'd spent a decade perfecting the art of telling people exactly as much as she wished them to know, and not one syllable more. It was, Poirot observed to me afterward, a history that explained Sophie Duval's presence at Ravensmoor entirely, and yet illuminated nothing whatever about the death of Lady Constance herself. For whatever grievance the young woman carried against the memory of Sir Edmund, it was a grievance 22 years in the ripening, and murder, in Poirot's long experience, was very rarely so patient a crime as that, when a more immediate and pressing motive lay so much closer at hand. "She is what she appears to be, I think," Poirot said, as we walked together in the garden that evening, the sky at last beginning to clear after 2 days of unbroken rain. "A woman in search of a truth that died with the two people best able to give it to her. It is a great sadness, Hastings, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the sherry glass upon Lady Constance's desk, or the bottle of digitalis in her dressing room, or the cufflink in the boathouse tin. I had wondered, when first I heard of her, whether old wounds might have found new violence in this house. It is, after all, a pattern one sees often enough in my profession. But no, this is a simpler story, for all its ugliness, and a sadder one, I think, than any 22-year-old scandal could account for." Julian, I said. Julian, Poirot agreed. And I think, mon ami, that we shall have the whole of it from Mademoiselle Hartley's careful ledger and from one further conversation before the day is entirely out. Chapter 13. Eleanor's Confession. It was Eleanor Hartley who came to Poirot a second time that evening, without summons, her composure by now entirely stripped away, her eyes red-rimmed with a grief that seemed, I thought, to carry within it a very particular quality of guilt. "There is something more I must tell you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, "something I have been too ashamed and too frightened to say before now." "I think, mademoiselle," said Poirot gently, "that you had better tell me all of it, and quickly, for I believe the hour has come when concealment can no longer serve anyone in this house, least of all yourself." "2 nights ago," Eleanor said, twisting her hands together in her lap, "after I had shown Lady Constance my notebook, after she had told me she meant to confront Julian formally, with Mr. Crane present, I could not sleep for the weight of what I had done. I went down to the study, very late, meaning only to sit a while and compose myself before returning to my room. Lady Constance was still awake, at her desk, and she was not alone. Julian was with her. Yes, I heard them before I reached the door. I ought to have announced myself at once, and I am ashamed that I did not, but something in his voice stopped me. He was pleading with her, Monsieur Poirot, in a manner I had never once heard from him in 12 years, begging her to give him time, to let him make good the shortfall quietly, before Mr. Crane ever saw the figures. He said that exposure would ruin him utterly, that he would rather die than face the disgrace of it laid before the whole family and the courts besides. And her response? She was unmoved. I have never heard her so cold, even with him. Eleanor's voice dropped almost to a whisper. She told him that Sir Edmund had built his name on honesty toward every government he served, and that she would not spend her last years watching his son destroy in secret what his father had spent a lifetime building in the light. She said Mr. Crane would have the full accounts on Monday, and that Julian's only choice now was to face the consequences like a man, or run from them like a coward, but that she would protect him from neither. And then? I left before I could hear more. I could not bear to listen further, and I was afraid of being discovered eavesdropping upon so private and so dreadful a quarrel. Eleanor pressed her hands to her face. I have told myself 100 times since that morning that I should have said something, to you, to the Colonel, to anyone, but I could not bring myself to be the one who pointed a finger at him, not without more certainty than an overheard argument could give me. And now she is dead, and I have been silent 2 full days about the one conversation that might have mattered most, and I do not know how I shall ever forgive myself for it. You could not have known, mademoiselle, what that conversation would come to mean, said Poirot, with a gentleness I had rarely heard him extend even to the most sympathetic of witnesses. Grief makes accusers of us all, in the small hours, when we search for someone to blame, even ourselves, when no other target presents itself. You did not kill her. You showed her a truth she had every right to know, and she chose, as was entirely her own right and her own character, to act upon it with courage rather than concealment. That is not a crime, mademoiselle. It is very nearly the opposite of one. Eleanor wept then, at last, the tears of 2 days' suppressed horror finally breaking free, and I withdrew quietly to fetch Mrs. Prentice and a restorative cup of tea, leaving Poirot to sit with her in a silence that seemed, for once, to require no further questions at all. Chapter 14. The Clock That Lied. It remained only, Poirot told Inspector Yardley that night, to establish beyond any reasonable doubt the true hour of Lady Constance's death, and this he proposed to do not through any further examination of the body, which Dr. Reeve had already studied as thoroughly as circumstances allowed, but through the humble and unimpeachable evidence of the mantel clock itself. "A clock," said Poirot, gathering us once more in the study where the tragedy had occurred. the small gilt timepiece still standing upon the mantel with its hands frozen at 11 minutes past 11, is a mechanism, Inspector, and mechanisms do not lie of their own accord. They are made to lie when it suits a human purpose by human hands. I have wound this clock myself, twice now, since the discovery of the body, and I find it keeps time with perfect accuracy, gaining and losing not a minute in 24 hours. It did not therefore stop upon its own account. Someone stopped it, moved the hands, I think, to 11 minutes past 11, and then, with a firm hand, arrested the pendulum, so that it should appear to any who found it that Lady Constance died at that hour precisely. "Why 11 minutes past 11?" asked Yardley. "Odd sort of hour to choose." "Because, Inspector, it is an hour at which Monsieur Julian Averill could plausibly claim to have already retired to his room. An hour before the true time of death, which I believe, upon the fuller evidence of the body's condition when Dr. Reeve examined it, to have fallen considerably later, somewhere between midnight and 1 o'clock. It is, you will notice, precisely the window during which Mademoiselle Duval observed a lantern moving upon the cliff path toward the boathouse, and precisely the window during which the tide, by the chart posted at the water's edge, made any crossing of the causeway entirely impossible. A detail which tells us, I think, that whatever business took Monsieur Averill from his room that night, it was not flight from this house, but rather some final desperate errand within its own grounds. "The bottle," I said slowly. "You think he came here, to the study, before he went down to the boathouse?" "I think," said Poirot, "that he came to this study some time after midnight, when the house was fully asleep, carrying with him the medicine bottle from the dressing-room next door, and that he administered to his stepmother, perhaps in a final glass of sherry offered as a gesture of reconciliation, perhaps simply poured without her full knowledge into a glass she believed to be her ordinary nightly dose, a quantity of digitalis very considerably in excess of what her weakened heart could sustain. I think that having done this dreadful thing, he sat with her, or waited nearby, until the medicine had done its terrible work, and that he then arranged her in the chair with the composure a man in the grip of horror sometimes discovers he still possesses, moved the clock's hands to establish a false hour, and carried the near-empty bottle, along with certain incriminating pages torn from Mademoiselle Hartley's ledger, which Lady Constance had evidently shown him, or which he had discovered upon her desk that very night, down to the boathouse to be disposed of at the earliest safe opportunity. A disposal interrupted, I think, by his own agitation, and by the small misfortune of a lost cuff-link that he did not discover missing until it was already too late to search for it, without drawing suspicion upon himself. The room had gone entirely silent. Inspector Yardley closed his notebook with a small, decisive snap. "That's a very complete account, Monsieur Poirot," he said, "assuming you can prove the half of it." "I believe," said Poirot, "that I can prove very nearly all of it, Inspector, but I think it will go a great deal better, both for the truth and for this unhappy family, if Monsieur Averill provides the final proof himself. Shall we gather everyone in the drawing-room? I believe the hour has come." Chapter 15. Poirot sets the stage. The drawing-room, when we assembled there that evening, wore an atmosphere quite unlike any I had experienced in the course of my long acquaintance with Poirot's methods, a stillness heavy with dread, as though the house itself understood that something irrevocable was about to be spoken aloud within its walls. Julian Averill sat somewhat apart from the others, his face composed into a mask of studied indifference that fooled, I think, no one present, least of all himself. Gerald Fenwick fidgeted with a glass he did not drink from. Sophie Duval sat very upright, her dark eyes fixed upon Poirot with an intensity that suggested she, too, sensed she was at last to receive some portion of the truth she had crossed a continent to find. Eleanor Hartley sat near the window, pale and composed once more, her ordeal of confession behind her. Colonel Bagshaw stood by the fire, one hand resting upon the mantel, as though he required its support. Dr. Reeve occupied a chair near the door, his professional composure visibly strained by the events of the past 2 days. Inspector Yardley stood, notebook in hand, a solid and watchful presence by the entrance, with a constable posted, discreetly but unmistakably, just beyond it. Poirot took his place at the centre of the room, with the unhurried gravity of an actor who has waited a lifetime for precisely this stage. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he began, "I have asked you to gather here this evening because I believe I am now in a position to tell you, with a very great degree of certainty, exactly how and why Lady Constance Averill met her death 2 nights ago. A death which I must tell you plainly, and without further softening, was not the natural failure of a weakened heart, as we were at first led to believe, but murder, deliberate and carefully arranged to appear as nothing more sinister than the sad but unsurprising end of a woman long known to be unwell. A small sound, I could not tell from whom, escaped someone in the room. I ask you to consider, first, 3 small facts that troubled me from the very morning her body was discovered," Poirot continued. "A clock, stopped at 11 minutes past 11, though I have proved it to keep perfect time when wound and left to its own honest mechanism. A bottle of medicine, very nearly emptied in a single night, though Dr. Reeve measured it with his own careful hand only 2 evenings before, and found it 3/4 full, and a fire, lit in the grate of a warm June night, to burn papers that someone in this house very urgently did not wish read by other eyes." He paced, slowly, before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. These 3 facts alone told me only that something was wrong, not who, nor precisely why. For that, I required to understand the ordinary currents of this household, and I found them, I confess, running a great deal deeper and darker than any polite dinner conversation had suggested. I found a shipping business in serious financial difficulty, concealed for many months through a systematic falsification of accounts. I found a secretary who had discovered this falsification and, at very great personal cost to her own peace of mind, brought it to Lady Constance's attention. I found a widow who, true to the diplomatic principles her husband had lived and died by, resolved to face the matter honestly, in the full light of her family solicitor's scrutiny, rather than permit it to be concealed a moment longer. His gaze moved, at last and without haste, to Julian Averill, who sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white where his hands gripped its arms. "And I found," Poirot said quietly, "a man who understood, on the night his stepmother told him plainly that his ruin was now only a matter of days away, that he could not survive the reckoning she intended to bring upon him. A man desperate enough, I believe, to do what desperate men have done since the beginning of recorded crime, which is to reach for the nearest and most convenient weapon at hand, and to trust that grief and a weak heart, already well known to the household, would together provide him the perfect and unquestioned disguise for murder." Chapter 16. The Weight of the Truth. "You will forgive me, Monsieur Poirot," said Julian Averill, his voice tight with a fury that could not quite conceal the fear beneath it, "if I ask what proof you imagine you possess, beyond a stopped clock and an empty bottle that might be explained a dozen innocent ways." "I possess," said Poirot, unmoved, "a cufflink, Monsieur Averill, engraved with your own initials, discovered this morning beneath a fisherman's tin in the boathouse at the foot of the cliff path, a boathouse to which your own footprints, distinctive for the mended heel of your boot, lead directly from this house, and from which they do not return by any path other than the one they took. I possess the testimony of Mademoiselle Duval, who from her window that night observed a lantern moving upon that very path between the hours of midnight and 1, precisely the window in which the causeway, by the tide chart posted at the water's edge, lay entirely submerged, so that whatever errand called you from your room, it was not, as you claimed, undisturbed sleep, nor any journey beyond these grounds, but something that required the privacy of that boathouse and nothing more." Julian said nothing, His face had gone the colour of old ash. "I possess also," Poirot continued, "the testimony of Mademoiselle Hartley, who overheard, 2 nights before your stepmother's death, a conversation in this very study in which you begged her for time to conceal the shortfall in the Cardiff accounts, a shortfall which I believe, upon inquiry, traces to a disastrous speculation in South American shipping insurance undertaken against your late father's own express counsel never to gamble with the firm's capital. And I possess, finally, the burned remnants of Mademoiselle Hartley's ledger, retrieved from the grate of this study, bearing figures and fragments of handwriting that will, I have no doubt, be matched by any competent expert to the very pages missing from her notebook. Pages, Monsieur Averill, that you took from your stepmother's desk on the night you killed her, and attempted, not quite successfully, to destroy. "This is conjecture," Julian said, but the words came without conviction now, like a man reciting a line he no longer believed. "It is conjecture built upon a very great weight of small, unglamorous but entirely truthful facts, Monsieur Averill, and I believe that when Inspector Yardley's experts have finished their examination of that bottle, that ledger, and the sherry glass beside which your stepmother was found, conjecture will harden very swiftly into certainty. But I will tell you what I believe happened, in full, and you may correct me where I err, for I think, in your heart, you have carried this alone long enough, and the carrying of it has become, I suspect, a far heavier burden than the confession you have so long dreaded." The room held its breath. Julian Averill's rigid composure, held so carefully through 2 days of questioning, broke at last all at once, like a dam long straining against a weight it could no longer bear. "She would have destroyed me," he said, his voice breaking. "Not out of cruelty. I could almost have forgiven cruelty. Out of principle. She sat there and told me that father would rather see the business fail honestly than survive on a lie. And I thought, God forgive me, I thought, she is 60 years old, her heart is already failing her. Would it not simply be a mercy, a kindness even, to let her go before Monday, before the whole ruin of it became public, before I lost everything, the business, the name, everything my father built? "So you went to her that night," said Poirot quietly, "with the bottle from her dressing-room, and you told yourself it was mercy, and not murder, though in your own heart, Monsieur Averill, I think you have known these 2 days past precisely which of the 2 words was the true one." Julian did not answer. He put his face in his hands, and the sound that came from him then was not the sound of a man protesting his innocence, but of a man who has, at last, set down a weight he could no longer carry alone, and finds beneath it only grief and ruin and the terrible clarity of what cannot now be undone. Inspector Yardley stepped forward, and the words he spoke were the plain, procedural words of the law, and yet in that hushed and grieving room they fell with all the weight of a door closing forever upon a house that would never again be quite what it had been. Chapter 17. The solicitor arrives. Mr. Aldous Crane arrived at Ravensmoor a little before noon the following day, driving his own dusty motor car across a causeway now dry and unremarkable in the thin autumn sunlight, as though the sea itself had lost interest in the drama it had so recently helped to conceal. He was a small, precise man of perhaps 60, with the permanently anxious expression of a solicitor who has spent 40 years absorbing other people's catastrophes as though they were his own, and he came, he told us gravely in the morning room, not merely to attend to the melancholy business of Lady Constance's will, but because Inspector Yardley had wired ahead, requesting that he bring with him the complete and certified accounts of Averill and Sons, that the case against Julian Averill might be built upon foundations no barrister could later shake. "I confess I am not entirely astonished," Crane said, laying a worn leather satchel upon the table with the particular care of a man handling something that might yet explode. "I had my suspicions of the Cardiff figures for some months, Monsieur Poirot, though I lacked the authority to examine the ledgers directly without Julian's consent, which he was, I need hardly tell you, remarkably reluctant to give. "I raised the matter with Lady Constance only a fortnight ago, and I confess I did not expect her to act upon it quite so swiftly, nor quite so fatally for herself." "You could not have foreseen it, Monsieur Crane," said Poirot. "No more than Mademoiselle Hartley could have done. A man does not measure the desperation of another until it is already far too late to weigh it accurately." Crane nodded heavily and opened the satchel, drawing out a sheaf of papers bound with faded pink tape. The accumulated record, I understood, of nearly a year's slow and increasingly reckless embezzlement. "The figures agree entirely with Miss Hartley's private notebook, so far as the surviving pages permit comparison," he said. "A little over £4,000, all told, diverted through falsified invoices to cover losses in a South American insurance speculation that Julian entered into against Sir Edmund's own express written instructions. Instructions I myself witnessed him sign some 6 years before his death, forbidding any officer of the firm from speculating with capital that was not, strictly, the firm's own to risk. A prohibition his son chose to disregard," said Poirot, "and then, having disregarded it once, found himself obliged to disregard it again and again, in ever more desperate proportion, until the lie had grown too large to sustain by ordinary means. It is always the way of it, in my experience," Crane said sadly. "The first falsehood is the smallest, and the easiest to tell oneself is harmless. It is the 40th or the 100th that a man finds he can no longer control." He glanced toward the window, where Julian Averill could be glimpsed, under the watchful eye of a constable, taking what would very likely be his last hour of exercise in the garden he had known since boyhood. "I confess I do not know what I feel for him this morning, Monsieur Poirot. I watched that boy grow up in this house. I cannot summon the simple hatred the newspapers will no doubt expect of everyone concerned, and yet I cannot forgive him either. Perhaps that is simply what grief becomes, in a case such as this, a grief with nowhere honest to rest itself. There remained, too, the question of Lady Constance's will, which Crane read aloud that same afternoon to the surviving family in the library, in a voice made carefully neutral by long professional habit. The bulk of the estate, as all had more or less anticipated, passed in trust for the eventual benefit of Julian's own children, should he ever have any, a provision now rendered bitterly ironic by the circumstances, while a smaller, but by no means ungenerous legacy was confirmed for Gerald Fenwick, on the sole and explicit condition, recorded in Lady Constance's own hand in a codicil dated some 18 months earlier, that he first demonstrate 12 consecutive months free of any fresh gambling debt, the sum to be administered in the meantime by Mr. Crane himself as trustee. "She thought of everything, even at the end," Gerald said afterward, standing rather unsteadily by the library window, and I could not tell, from his voice, whether the words were spoken in gratitude or in a fresh and sobering species of shame. 12 months. She knew I'd never manage it left to my own devices, and she was quite right, and she found a way to save me from myself, regardless of whether I deserved the saving. I don't know how a person is meant to mourn someone who was that clever about loving you. Eleanor Hartley, too, was remembered, a sum sufficient to secure her modest independence, together with a brief handwritten note that Crane produced separately from the formal will, in Lady Constance's own decisive hand, which he read to her alone, and which she would not, then or afterward, repeat to any of us, though I saw her weep over it a second time that evening, and understood that whatever it contained had gone some considerable way toward easing the burden of guilt she had carried since the discovery of the body. "A household does not end when its mistress dies," Poirot observed to me quietly, as we watched Crane depart once more across the causeway that evening, his satchel considerably heavier with the certified accounts that would, in due course, form the backbone of the case against Julian Averill. "It merely rearranges itself around the absence, Hastings, the way water rearranges itself around a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples reaching, eventually, every shore, even the ones the stone itself never touched. Chapter 18. What the Sea Leaves Behind. The causeway lay clear and dry beneath a pale, washed sky the following morning, the storm entirely spent, as Poirot and I stood upon the terrace of Ravensmoor House, awaiting the motor car that would carry us at last back toward the mainland and the ordinary world beyond it. Inspector Yardley's men had departed some hours before, taking with them all that remained to be taken, and the house behind us had settled into the particular hushed exhaustion that follows any great sorrow, not yet grief, quite, for grief requires time to arrive in full, but something adjacent to it, a bruised and careful quiet. "I keep thinking," I said, "of what he told you, that he believed it a mercy, almost, rather than a murder. Do you suppose he believed it, Poirot, even for a moment?" "I suppose," said Poirot, watching the last of the tide withdraw from the causeway stones, "that a man in the grip of ruin will believe almost anything that permits him to act. Hastings, for the alternative, to sit quietly and watch his own destruction arrive by the slow and honest road his stepmother had chosen for him, required a courage he did not possess. It is the oldest lie in the world, that one, dressed up in new and pitiable clothes each time a desperate man tells it to himself, that the swift, secret cruelty is somehow kinder than the slow, honest reckoning. It is never so. It is only quicker, and only for the man who tells himself the lie, never for the one who pays the price of it. And Sophie Duval, what becomes of her question now, with Lady Constance gone and unable to answer it? "I spoke with Colonel Bagshaw before we retired last night," said Poirot. "He has agreed to write, on Mademoiselle Duval's behalf, to certain old colleagues at the Foreign Office, who may yet have access to the papers of that inquiry 22 years past. An imperfect justice, and a very late one, but I think it is the only justice now available to her, and I believe, from what I have seen of her character, that she will pursue it with considerably more patience than her father's accusers ever showed him. It is not nothing, Hastings, to have one's father's name examined honestly at last, even so many years too late for him to know of it. And Eleanor, and Gerald. Mademoiselle Hartley will carry her own small burden of guilt a while yet, I think, though it is not hers to carry, and I believe in time she will set it down, for she is a woman of considerable good sense beneath her present grief. As for young Fenwick," Poirot's mouth twitched very slightly, "I understand Mr. Crane, the solicitor, has already begun the melancholy business of untangling Lady Constance's estate, and I suspect that Lady's own good sense, which extended even to a codicil drawn some years past, and never entirely rescinded, will prove considerably kinder to her nephew's future than his own recent conduct perhaps deserved. She was, whatever else may be said of her, a woman who understood the difference between weakness and wickedness, Hastings, and I think she judged her family accordingly, even from beyond the grave." The motor car appeared at last at the far end of the causeway, making its careful way across the wet stones toward us, and Poirot drew his coat a little closer against the cool morning air, watching it come with the particular satisfaction, quiet, unshowy, entirely his own, that I had come to recognize, over so many years of friendship, as the truest measure of a case well and honestly concluded. "It is a sad philosophy in the end, that this house has taught us this weekend, mon ami," he said, "though I think not, perhaps, an unfamiliar one. Every family guards its ledgers, in one fashion or another, some of money, some of grievance, some of simple, ordinary love, grown complicated with the passing years. It is only when the guarding becomes concealment, and the concealment becomes desperation, that the little grey cells are required to intervene, and even then, Hastings, they can only ever restore the truth. They cannot restore what the truth, once told, so often costs." He said nothing further as the motor car drew up before us, and together, in a silence that felt, for once, entirely companionable rather than watchful, we left Ravensmoor House to the sea and the tide and whatever quiet reckoning still remained for those we left behind its grey and dripping walls. The end.